Our next speaker, one of the Gang of Four, the originals, been around forever, since 2004, the one and only Gerard Batten.
Thank you very much, everybody. Now, we're supposed to finish at past. Do you mind if I eat 10 minutes into your lunch break? Right. Now, I'm going to start by assuming that everybody here wants to leave the European Union. Is that correct? I kind of thought that was. So what I'd like to do now is ask you three simple questions. How many of you want to leave the European Union as quickly as possible? Number two, how many of you would like us to keep open borders with the European Union? And how many of you would like us to go on paying money into the EU budget after we leave? I thought that was the response I was going to get. In that case, I'd like to explain to you how you can have number one, but don't have to have number 2 and 3. Now, 7 weeks ago, as you know, British people voted in a referendum to leave the European Union. And what's happened since? Nothing. Mrs May hasn't even managed to write the simple letter to the European Council saying that she wants to trigger Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. Now, it's accepted wisdom that a member state can only leave the European Union by using Article 50. Well, what does Article 50 actually say? It lays out an obscure and ill-defined mechanism for leaving the EU, which is like joining, only in reverse. Instead of negotiating your way in, we have to negotiate our way out. So let's just recap for a moment on what Article 50 actually says, and I'll make 6 simple points. Number one, any member state can leave the European Union according to its own constitutional requirements. Number two, the member state deciding to withdraw has to notify the European Council, the heads of government, and shall negotiate an agreement on withdrawal with the Council. Number three, the period from notification to conclusion shall be 2 years. However, number four, the negotiating period may be extended indefinitely with the unanimous agreement of the other member states. Number five, the member state withdrawing may not participate in the discussions of the European Council or its decisions concerning it. And number six, to conclude, the final agreement has to be approved by a decision of the European Council by a qualified majority vote after they have obtained the consent of a vote of the European Parliament. So where are we? If the European Council or the Parliament rejects the final agreement, we're back to square one. However, at that point, the withdrawing member does have the right to withdraw unilaterally anyway. So at the end of 2 years of protracted and painful negotiations, we could find ourselves in exactly the same position we started out in, wanting to leave, but with no agreement with the European Union. Now, let me say that all of this talk about a deal with the European Union is a complete red herring. No deal is required. Before the Lisbon Treaty was signed, there was no mechanism for a member state to leave the European Union. Now, that in itself was a danger, because any member state could just tear up the treaty and walk away. Article 50 was, in my view, created deliberately and precisely in order to delay and prevent any country actually leaving the EU. Article 50 is a trap. So if we don't want to be delayed and prevented, what should we do? Remember that Article 50 says that any nation may withdraw in accordance with its own constitutional requirements. So let's take a look at our constitutional requirements. We joined the European Economic Community on the 1st of January 1973 by means of the European Communities Act 1972. This Act made us members of the EC and gave EU law supremacy over domestic law. Now, I won't bore you here now with a long litany, a dreary long litany of successive EU treaties that have taken away more and more power from our own Parliament and transferred it transferred them to the European Union so that it now controls most areas of domestic policy. But we are a member, and we remain a member of the European Union purely by means of the 1972 Act. And Parliament has the right to repeal that Act any time it likes. Now, when we do leave the European Union, we will have to repeal the European Communities Act anyway. Now, that can either happen at the end of the process or it can happen at the beginning of the process, but it will have to be repealed because it is only it that makes us members. Now, what I'm going to do now is describe a method, a mechanism for leaving the EU will save us a great deal of time, effort and trouble and possibly grief, and ensure that we do not end up with some kind of deal that we don't want. Now, I happen to have written a little book on this subject entitled The Road to Freedom, which goes into a great deal of detail. And I'm going to summarise the main points. If anyone would like a copy of this book, I'm upstairs in the Purbeck room, and they're £5 a copy. But let me describe in a 5-point plan how we can leave the European Union. Parliament should immediately repeal the European Communities Act 1972. This would immediately return lawmaking supremacy to our own Parliament and jurisdiction to our own courts. Now, number two, the Repealing Act should specify that all EU directives which have been transposed into Acts of Parliament and EU regulations will remain in force until amended or repealed by Parliament. Chaos would not there ensue. Point number three. However, this would allow us to take immediate action to introduce emergency legislation on immigration and border control and restore control of border control and immigration. Number four, a special parliamentary committee should be set up to scrutinise the amendment and repeal of thousands upon thousands of directives, regulations and judgments until we are left with only those that suit us and allow us to interact with the EU on our terms. And lastly, number five, while all this is happening, we can have the very friendly but firm negotiations with the EU to decide those matters about trade and cooperation that we wish to continue with. Now, the big difference between this method and using Article 50 is that by repealing the 1972 Act, the British Parliament and government is put in the driving seat and not the EU. Now, I'm not naive. I know that Mrs May and Parliament don't want to do this, and it would be difficult, if not impossible, to get a majority to do this in Parliament as it's constituted at the moment. But that's not the point. Now, I think it was Bismarck that said, politics is the art of the possible. But surely UKIP has proved that our politics is the art of achieving that which everybody else said was impossible. We did it after 24 years of hard work by achieving the referendum. And having won that referendum, we must now aim for complete withdrawal from the European Union on our terms, not the EU's. We've got no reason to trust Theresa May. In her 6 years as Home Secretary, she was an enthusiastic enforcer of EU legislation on justice and home affairs matters. She was a remainder in the referendum, and not to forget, of course, that she was a complete and utter total failure in controlling immigration. Now, as I said, she's not even written the little note on her flowered note paper or whatever to the European Council to trigger Article 50. What I fear is that she intends to delay our withdrawal from the EU until she can find a way of reneging on her promise to make Brexit mean Brexit. Now, if she delays beyond the next general election, the next Parliament could claim that it has a new mandate and it could refuse to implement the referendum decision, which of course was only consultative anyway. It has no legal force. Or perhaps she will contrive to arrive at some kind of deal that looks like the Swiss or Norwegian options, and that would mean open borders, it would mean paying contributions to the EU budget, it would mean being bound by a very large percentage of EU law, in which case we might as well not have bothered in the first place. Now, some people would tell you that we can't repeal the Act because of our obligations under international law. This is not so. Treaties are merely agreements between governments. They have no force in English law until they are enacted as Acts of Parliament. And those Acts of Parliament can be repealed by Parliament. Now, those who feel squeamish about walking away from a treaty should remember that history is littered with abandoned treaties that have outlived their usefulness. A people that chooses to be free cannot be bound by a treaty dishonestly entered into 44 years previously and which has robbed them of their freedom. UKIP secured the referendum, and it was UKIP, it wasn't anybody else, by means of its electoral threat. Now we must keep up the pressure by rejecting Article 50 and demanding that we leave as quickly as possible by repealing the European Communities Act as a first step. If we don't do that, as I said, we may find that we never actually leave at all. UKIP was right about leaving the European Union, and we are right about this. We didn't lack the foresight, determination and courage to fight to win the referendum, and we must not lack the fight, those same qualities in the fight to leave the European Union. Before I close, let me take a sounding of the audience. How many people think we should repeal the 1970 European Communities Act first? All shout repeal. Repeal! How many people are fans of Article 50? There's always got to be one, hasn't there? Well, our real job is now just beginning, which is to make Brexit mean Brexit. Brexit must mean Brexit. Now, I'm not looking for any more work. I'm pretty busy at the moment. But if our new leader, Diane James, was to ask me to be the spokesman on Brexit, then I couldn't refuse. Thank you.